ActRaiser, one of the first released game titles for the Super Famicom console, or known as SNES outside of Japan, that sticks out to me throughout the years. Despite it's one of my first God games I've ever played, along with Populous the Beginning on the PS1, ActRaiser is one of those games I remembered about, but not exactly that much, considering I was a kid the last time I played it. I end up remembering the soundtrack quite well, along with its god simulation part of the game, but not much on the platforming side of things, along with the story parts of it. Seeing ActRaiser Renaissance gets its release, I wanted to replay the original first before moving on to that game, especially that I do have a plan on covering that game fully for this year. This is K1PM. Today's full review is gonna be a bit different. Not only would I talk about the ActRaiser US version, I'll also be comparing to the Japanese release version, considering there's quite a lot of differences in between those two, aside from the obvious translation of it, of course, spotting some of the differences and pointing out the pros and the cons of it. ActRaiser was developed by Quintet, a Japanese game company who made a decent amount of popular games in the past, like Soul Blazer, Shenmue, and one of my personal favorites, Terranigma and Illusion of Gaia. Unfortunately though, the developers seemed to die out in the end, seeing their last published game was way back in 2004. They possibly got absorbed by other companies, probably Enix with their close relations and all. ActRaiser on the other hand is rather rare for its time. God games aren't that common as to compare to the other genre of games. Even in today's times, it's rather rare to find a game like that, especially in this case with a mixture of platforming elements, following a bit of the classic styles of Castlevania, while retaining that concept of a God sim game, but on a minimal scale to say the least. The game starts with a few control instructions and a greeting from an angel, assisting the player as a god, or known as the Master, from recovering of its lost strength, that was sealed by a demon called Tanzra. In the absence of a god, different types of demons lay claim to the land, pillaging the innocents and ravaging the fields. Most of the people went on hiding because of it. Now, it's up to the player to clear every demons in all 6 regions, by going down to the different demons' lair and slaughter their leaders one by one, and also protecting the people during these sections. You could select which region you could go first, but it's only possible once you meet the required level, providing a bit more freedom to choose rather than following a set of pace. Although it's advisable just to follow this set of order here first, instead of jumping to the much more harder stages, as well as rekindling the people's faith of their one true God by showing them the power of smiting demons and exposing those blasphemous demons who tries to steal my people away from me. As a God simulator game, you create a thriving land in order for the people to prosper, clearing a bunch of obstacles along the way to have a more habitable land on different biomes, following a series of requests from each respective towns, while defending them against airborne demons and guiding them to close these summoning pits, provides a bit of balance in the player's experience in between. It wouldn't be just a city simulator-like experience of planning and idling for a bit throughout the whole game. And just to be clear, I know that some people believe that there's an RTS element to the game, to which there's actually none. I've played a lot of different RTS games in the past, and I'm sure of it. It's more accepting to suggest that it has a bit more city simulator-like elements to it, rather than the RTS one. Now, going back to the defending part, the monsters during at these stages are actually easy to beat, although it's a bit annoying how they constantly spawn in the game too frequently. Not only do they attack the angel you control, but prioritizing on destroying the town overall. Whether it'll be stealing your people, destroying your houses, creating droughts on the field, or just outright smashing everything up with an earthquake. It kinda takes a bit of practice when dealing them off. Luckily, there's a few power-ups that you could pick up from the offering, as well as those godly weather powers do come in handy. It also kinda feels too easy seeing how your angel doesn't actually die when the HP reaches to 0, but it only stops you from attacking any further. I just kinda wish they could at least add more consequence to the game rather than being more lenient about it. In the end though, it's just a minor thing, so it's all good. Some specific summoning pits, when cleared by your worshippers, offer different types of rewards for the player. Like magic scrolls increases the maximum mana, tech rewards for building bridges, a statue that's used for raiding dungeons, and many other things. But what's important the most is the increase of the civilization level of a town. Every new region you unlock starts out at a level 0. Buildings would be made from straws and twigs at that point. By the time the civilization level increases, people would start building better houses and farms. And when there's better houses they build, more people would start living in the land, providing a much more greater population for a region. And when a player reaches a higher total population count, this actually increases the player's level, increasing the maximum HP for both the angel and the player on the platform side. This what makes the destruction of lower level buildings sounds an appealing way to improve on, since the people are kinda reluctant to upgrade their houses on their own, and that's where playing the god comes in nicely. If the people won't improve their houses, I just give them a gentle push. You know, raining down lightning bolts at them or creating violent earthquakes on the whole region. They wouldn't complain since, well, I'm the one in charge out of all. And when some of the people gets tired with all the work they've been doing, well, there's only one way to settle things for good. That's one of the creative aspects of the game, especially if you grew up playing this game before. Although it's a bit unfortunate how the game lacks a bit of interactivity towards the people themselves, outside from the main story of the game. In the Japanese version of the game, however, it's a bit more difficult on the God Sim part. You can't exactly just regenerate SP anymore on just waiting. You gotta have to farm it on killing the enemies or leveling up in the game. And if you cleared every of those summoning circles on the map, you gotta have to be careful on using your godly powers. You don't want to exactly waste it on such things. Now when it comes to the platforming side of the game, however, it's actually good. Not exactly the best kind I've ever played, yet it's still enjoyable, that's for sure. But there's two problems I've noticed: the flawed level design of the game and the character's movement mechanic. First of all, when it comes to the art design on each stages and the enemies, it's overall good actually. Especially for a game that was designed during the early 90s or early days of SNES times. Although there were quite a few censorship made in between, which is pretty much understandable for some parts of the game. But there's one thing I'm sure of: the designs of the US version is actually much more better compared to the Japanese version of the game. Especially when you compare these kinds of designs on the enemies. In my opinion, the designs works better in the US version. I kinda prefer my enemies to wear proper themed clothes and not just butt-naked monsters around. But you know what? I guess it's alright. Now going back to the two problems on the level design and character movements. When it comes to the level design itself, the placement of objects and enemies, it's actually not that great. Especially pairing it up with a sluggish camera setting of the game, there were quite a few troubles I had to encounter in between. I understand that these styles offers a kind of challenge for the player, and it's all good with me. But there were certain points that just felt unfair. Take a look at this clip I've made on my playthrough of the game. That's actually my first try on my rerun of it, and I haven't played this game for years already when I was a kid, so I don't exactly remember these kind of sections within the level design. Luckily though, the game is quite forgiving. The amount of extra lives and maximum HP that could be attained what actually eases off the difficulty. It's alright to lose when you could easily get up again. The Japanese version, however, is much worse. There's too many blind spots that could actually kill off the player. And there were a lot of tight jumps that require exact timing as to compared to the US version, which can be absolutely frustrating in the end. The Japanese version of the game offers little room for errors in a very unfair way. Especially when you end up dying in between stages, you'll actually lose a bunch of your scores. And scores actually matters, as it ties with the increasing of maximum population count in the God Sim part of the game. And yeah, I know. It kinda sounds weird in a way, but that's just how it is in this game. The US version, however, is much more lenient though, as dying doesn't actually reset the score. Honestly, I'm actually quite glad they've balanced a lot of those kinds of problems. It's a good thing they've polished it off properly on the US version. Now when it comes to the character movements, you could walk around, jump on different platforms, and do some basic attacks and magic skills. You know, the basic kinds of controls for most platform games. The problem I had with the game is the jumping mechanics and the skills available to use on. I know this might sound nitpicky at this point, but just hear me out. When you do a run and jump mechanic in the game, you're forced to move on towards a certain direction, without being able to move back a bit while in mid-air. You could stop moving forward a bit, but not exactly go back to the opposite direction. Just like a bit how Castlevania or other platform games work. Well, not that exactly, but I think you get the gist of it. But what I don't understand is, why would they implement that kind of mechanic when I could just jump first and be able to move on to any direction while in mid-air, as to compare to the run and jump kind of mechanic? It's a bit counterintuitive, you could say. Honestly, I'm already a bit frustrated how bad some of the collisions in the game can be. It's a good thing I didn't encounter this problem that much, however. So, I guess I'll let that slide for now. On this kind of problem, I usually see this on this kind of stage only. When it comes to the magic spells for the game, they can be a bit unbalanced in a way. Magic spells are really strong when you use them in battle. Not only does it vary on the range and damage that can be dealt to the enemy, but it also gives a brief invincibility period. Although you gotta collect some magic scrolls during the God Sim part of it, and it's actually not that hard to find at least. But the spells can be too strong in a way. You could actually just spam a bunch of it just to kill the boss easily. Especially this Magic Stardust spell, it's too overpowered. If you find it hard to win in the game, you could just spam this to beat every boss in the game that easy. Well, to be honest though, you don't exactly need to cast spells that much for boss bosses, seeing how most of the boss is actually quite easy to beat, having a much more simpler AI with a few limited obvious patterns. Some bosses are alright to fight against, while some of them are just too simple, to the point I can actually just tank every damage from the boss and just spam my attacks without worrying of dying in the game. It's kinda a bit disappointing to see it this way, but I guess that's how just older games are. Not to mention how some of the enemies in the game are much more simpler compared to the Japanese version of the game, having more extra movements available that an enemy or boss could do. I'm not actually quite sure why they've decided to do this. I guess perhaps to lessen the difficulty for most of the players. But oh well. ActRaiser itself has a much more simpler take towards the God Sim genre. If you notice by now, there's only a few limited things that a player could do, unfortunately. But at the least, the game thrives on the dialogue aspects of the story. The people usually begs for help and talks about their current situation, talking about their runaway son, or guiding them to their lost friend in the desert to just blossom a few wins for them, or call a rain for this poor guy dying. I really like on how the story is shown in these kind of scenarios. You wouldn't just see and read their dialogues over here, but you can actually see their struggles outside of it. Like the time when both of the parents' son was chosen as a sacrificial offer to the demons. You could actually see their son over here, being the ever so clumsy kind of person, traveling to the demon's castle. There's even some expeditions in the game where you could actually see them trying to search for something in order to give it to me later on as an offering. These kind of little hints to the story what makes the game memorable in its own way. Even though it might be a bit too simplified or too scripted in some scenarios, the story itself is still decently alright as a God Sim game in an older console. Although it's nothing that spectacular, of course, compared to the other JRPG games like Illusion of Gaia and Terranigma. At the very last stage of the game, it offers a sort of boss rush mode to fight against every Act 2 boss in every region. They're kinda alright to beat. It's not that hard honestly, especially with all the extra lives available and spells to abuse on. After beating the whole game, the angel congratulates me for beating the whole thing and starts to recall all of the achievements I've done in the game. It's pretty much a straightforward thing, I guess. No alternate endings or extra stuff to accomplish, sadly. I even tried to do a sort of genocide route just to be sure, but it's still the same thing. Although there's the professional mode that I could do once I finish the game. It follows on a series of all platform levels without the godsend part of it. Most of the enemies have much more health on them, while you can't use any more of those abusive spells, making some of the item drops within stages are replaced with a different item instead. Gotta rely heavily on the basic attacks throughout the whole professional stages. One of the things that kept me reminded of ActRaiser is its memorable soundtrack to listen on. Not only does it have that Castlevania soundtrack feel to it, but ActRaiser has that benevolent divine music to listen on, with a mixture a bit of ominous feel to it within stages. Not to mention, the first stage soundtrack in the game is absolutely stunning to hear, especially for a game that transitions to a newer generation of consoles. It kind of felt amazing the first time I've listened to it. Although to be fair, some of the soundtracks in the game are kinda okay, I guess. The only ones I find decently good are these soundtracks out of all, especially during at these stages, both in Fillmore and in Bloodpool. Absolutely one of my personal favorites. That's why I give this game a rating of 8 out of 10. It's pretty much interesting how the mixture of a god sim and a platform genre plays actually well within a game's theme. It might not be the best god sim to play as for some people, with its simple approach for these kinds of sections, at the same time having an alright unbalanced kind of play in terms of the mechanics in the game. But the designs, the soundtracks, and the story plays along quite well. Playing as a benevolent god while being able to play as a decent platforming game in between, it was an enjoyable, refreshing game to play. If you're wondering how I'd rate the Japanese version of it, I'd probably give it a 7.5 out of 10. That whole problem they have it there, they could have at least fixed a lot of it. If you're looking for a unique game to play for the SNES, I'd recommend this game for you to pick up on. Although at this point, however, I'm really curious what would the ActRaiser Renaissance has to offer. For more videos such as these, why not head down to my channel to check things out? I do accurate game reviews of the past games, and some other new ones too. If you want to support my channel, a subscribe would be really helpful. It kinda helps me out morally, to be honest. This is K1PM, and I bid you farewell.